I'm going to draw from a library of case studies. We have about 20,000 experiments in our library. I run an institution in the US. And you'll see that this is sort of the framework of a very granular question I'd like to raise at the beginning. And the organization is the company that invented the notion of the press release, pioneered it 60 years ago. And I want to show you a piece of collateral. This is collateral from their business. It's designed, as Ken was referencing, to get a yes, as in every piece of collateral, every offer that goes into the marketplace. In fact, entrepreneurship itself is dependent upon achieving a yes. It's yes that creates a customer. It's a customer that says yes to the offer. And this is highly granular, but just for a moment. We'll get more abstract in just a bit. But if you would look at this piece and ask yourself, if I was the consumer or I was a business coming to this page and I wanted to take my message and distribute it, would I respond to this particular offer, or what would I do to make it more persuasive? Now, I realize in the 12-minute time frame that I have, I can't spend a long time asking that question. But the leaders from this organization were asking the same question, and they needed some way to answer it besides a committee meeting, besides some advice from an agency. They needed a framework. And so I want you to see the version they began with, and then researchers from my organization, Mech Labs, took that original version and reframed it with this version. Now, you might note the two pages don't look very different, but something fundamental is happening in the thought sequence of those who engage the page. And the method by which this page is arrived at is a very particular method which involves the framework of the value proposition, the essential reason that this business comes to the marketplace and makes an ask. We reframed the value proposition on this page, and what you'll notice is a difference not only in the page but in the performance. So I'm going to show you the result of an experiment where we framed a single factorial test design, and as people visited this page, we shifted back and forth between A and B in real time over thousands of actions, measuring those and doing the statistical analysis. What you'll notice is that version B, version A, side by side, you'll see version B produces a 74% increase in revenue flow. Now, I share that with you because it's an indicator of something very significant that we've been studying for some 20 years in our research laboratory. And it's essential also for the dialogue that I've been hearing in the last 2 days. And indeed, it leads to sort of one of 2 points that I would like to make to sort of frame the discussion. And that is that we need to understand the value proposition as being essential to the thriving enterprise. There's much talk about thriving, and there's much talk about the prosperous enterprise, the enterprise that is experiencing wellness. And we have been asking a question that sort of has driven 25 years of research, really, and that is only this: why do people say yes? Given a set of options, why would they say yes? This has spiritual implications when people are embracing a paradigm or a faith perspective. This has business and commercial implications, and frankly, this question has in many ways messed up my entire life as I've gone back and analyzed why I said yes and made dramatic and very painful changes. And I share it with you because there are 2 or 3 key factors that, if we understand, can help us take a lot of what we've talked about today and bring it in. I'm going to use a business term and cash it in at the level of praxis. Here's the first point. The essence of entrepreneurship is marketing. And the essence of marketing is the message. And the essence of the message is the value proposition. The goal of the entrepreneur is not to create a company, but to create a customer. There is no company if at first we can't frame and attract a customer. The company is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. Serving the customer is really the first task of the leader. And thinking about that way, let's call this a warrant on the screen, and we'll talk about how this warrant works. We have been asking for many years, what the word value proposition might truly mean. The phrase was coined by Michael Lanning. Michael's a friend of mine, in the early 90s in a book. Businesses are using it everywhere, but very few institutions have done any significant work on the actual framework. We've analyzed 1,100 academic articles. We've gone back over 100 years of literature and studied frames that did not use the word but might reference the term. And then we've conducted a series of experiments, all trying to develop a robust way to frame the notion of the value proposition. I don't want to break all of that down or touch this heuristic except to say, for the purposes of this discussion, we can translate the heuristic and the learnings and all of the experiments into a simple question that every enterprise must ask itself. And that question is this: if I am, and you'll notice there's a shift here, there's a very important shift from the third person to the first person. If I am your ideal customer, why should I buy from you rather than any one of your competitors? Now, philosophically, and my training is in philosophy and theology, philosophically we could transcend that with why should I select this option over another, and it would apply to many other disciplines. But let's just look at it from a commercial standpoint, because in the absence of a good answer, the enterprise is left to survive on pockets of ignorance. Thriving is really not in the making of its future. And indeed, when you take that tight question and you apply it to the page that we saw, it led to a series of hypotheses about what might be the best answer. Every enterprise has to formulate a sort of ultimate reason that justifies its existence. That ultimate reason becomes its value proposition. It is indeed an academic argument, framed with and represented by a sort of primary reason. So what we experimented here literally was two different answers to that question. And what's so important about this experiment is it allowed us to see which one of these mental levers, when pulled, would produce the highest response rate, the highest number of yeses. Now, this organization for 60 years has been trying to grow, but it thought that the answer above would be its best performing option, and all that we did was use some heuristics to start discerning what might be another lever to pull, another way to articulate that reason, a better answer. And then we experimented to let the customer tell us firsthand which one was most compelling. And as we saw from the test, the second, version B, produced 74% more revenue, which is a dramatic increase for them. And as you start to see that sort of cash in on the screen, it leads to a deeper understanding of this third point. In the absence of a compelling response, the entrepreneur is forced to survive on these pockets of ignorance. A company's future isn't secured by speaking louder, by making more noise, by making lots of claims, by lots of persuasion. But indeed, clarity trumps persuasion. Innovating so that the answer to that question is legitimate is the key to the company's success. Now, we have a group of individuals here that are not just concerned with a thriving enterprise, but a good enterprise. And it sort of leads to the question that I want to lead in the last and second and final point of this short time I have with you at the front here. How can the concept of the value proposition help us achieve business for the common good? How can it help us develop the good business? And that's what intrigues me the most, because around the world, as we've been conducting experiments in the largest companies in the world, Verizon revenue is $128 billion and touches lives everywhere. What could we do to provide in our pedagogy to the aspiring entrepreneur or to the experienced business leader a new framework that impacts them not just at the level of maxims for ethics, but at the ontological essence of their business, in the being, not just the doing? And in that way, and towards that end, we've been conducting some experiments to understand the answer to that question. And I have always been, my father was a missionary, I've always been interested in deep questions that I could not answer in the way I hoped most, and had to find simple frameworks to test and experiment to go back and analyze the deeper points that I was trying to sort of capture. And so I just share with you a couple of things from this discovery. We don't need to break this down except to say this is an essential equation that really is just a heuristic, and it's subtracting the force of value from the force of the cost, not the price, but the cost. And it's simply saying that when I ask you to do a particular thing, like purchase a product, on the one hand, there is the value that I promise. And on the other hand, there is the total cost to you, which it would include your anxiety and your friction and your risk and the price. And that if the price outweighs, or if the cost outweighs the value, not many people are going to say yes. Now, I find this very important, not just from the standpoint of bringing together a sort of alignment and integrity between the offer and the results, but in many countries where we want to encourage thriving, businesses are simply copying a model they might have seen in the West without understanding how to deliver a value proposition that will produce thriving in that emerging economy. It has implications for there, but more importantly, it has implications for how we articulate the value. So let's cut through this, and let me just take you in the last few moments to this little Venn diagram. Over the years, when we ask the question, let's take an enterprise that's selling musical instruments. Someone mentioned a family that sells musical instruments. So let's just take that for a moment. Why should I buy a musical instrument? Did you sell pianos? Okay. So why should I buy a piano from your company rather than any other company that I can do this with? All right? So that might be limited by the geography, but depending on whatever that frame of options is. Now, the answer that you give to that question, whatever that answer is, forms the essence of your value proposition. And if it's not a business model, it's not a slogan, it's not an advertising cliche, but it has to be a reason. Now, the trick is this. That reason has to have sufficient appeal to move me. But it also has to have sufficient exclusivity to keep me selecting your option as opposed to another. I can get appeal at any moment. I can get appeal by offering pianos. There are people who want pianos, but the problem is there's other places to buy a piano. How do I get exclusivity? I can get exclusivity quite easily. I can get exclusivity by putting a music player in this remote control so that I can stick it in my ear and listen to music when I'm speaking at the platform. But does it have sufficient appeal in the marketplace to get much traction? No. So it's easy to find exclusivity, it's easy to find appeal, but it's very, very difficult to find the zone that overlaps both. And this is where the thriving occurs for an enterprise. But that thriving is not enough. Because even if this is true, there must be a way to communicate it that penetrates the defenses of a jaded consumer. And indeed, that's where the second part of this heuristic, there's sort of two dyads, the appeal and the exclusivity, and the final dyad is the clarity and the credibility. Now, those words get in the way of understanding because they really fostered conclusions. The goal of our communication should not be to make a claim, but to generate a conclusion. And there are 4 conclusions that someone has to make if they're going to purchase a piano from my friends. Apparently, you don't own the business now, but if they were to purchase a piano from that business, there's 4 conclusions they must make. First of all, I want this. Secondly, I can't get this the way I want it anywhere else. There's something unique about how you're going to deliver this to me. Now, before they can make those 2 conclusions, I want this and I can't get it anywhere else, and this is true of any enterprise. This is true of this event. If you had another event like this today, you'd have to choose this event. There's a bit of exclusivity here, would you agree? There's not a lot of places to go to have this dialogue. I want this, and I can't get it anywhere else. It's why you chose this use of your time. But even in doing so, you have to come to 2 communication points prior to that, and that is, I understand this. In other words, someone had to communicate this event to you. Someone has to communicate that piano offer to you. I understand this, and I believe this. Listen, philosophically, you cannot there's no way to escape those 4 fostered conclusions as the primary drivers of success for any enterprise. And here's what's remarkable about them. When you bring them to bear on an enterprise, it forces you to understand. This is my last sort of content slide. It forces you to ask, what is the value that I'm truly delivering, and how do I communicate it with clarity and credibility? And in doing so, it changes the locus of our activity from persuasion to a sort of integral alignment between the offer that we carry to the market and the way we communicate it. And in doing so, its ethical correction occurs almost organically. It changes a lot of the nonsense and white noise you hear. And so an example of that in this final slide comes from one of the carriers that I track in the US because of my relationship with Verizon. If you'll look on the wall, we have many groups where we're running experiments like this. You'll see a value proposition on the screen from AT&T. It says we have the nation's fastest, do you hear exclusivity in that? Mobile broadband network and the largest international coverage of any US wireless carrier, offering the most phones that work in the most countries and the largest Wi-Fi network in the United States based on branded operated hotspots. Now, I would tell you, in fairness, that does that message have appeal? And you can see we've ranked it as a 4 on a simple scale. Does it have exclusivity? Would you agree it has exclusivity? Does it have clarity? I would say it's a little cumbersome, but let's call it a 3. Does that make sense? Now here's what's really, when you break down that heuristic you saw on the previous page, here's what will kill you. This is a multiplier. This has a divisional relationship. This paradigm, these two dyads work in a unique way. Whatever the sum is in this box, I must multiply by the others. So what is the problem with this? Well, if you ask the average US consumer, do you believe what AT&T just said here? What would be the answer? No. And there might be some other 4-letter words added to it if they've had much experience. And so what happens is, if you place 0 in credibility and multiply it by the other, you're back to 0. Everything's wiped out. And in that you start to see the inherent corrective at the essence of both the value offered and the value communicated. Now I'm out of time. And I am not trying to get so technical as to become impractical. But I want to suggest that as we think about how to bring thriving to an enterprise, there's a way to impose a framework or to offer a framework that both helps it to grow and helps it to behave in a way that's valuable to all of its stakeholders. I've seen it in these situations. This is the University of New England. Look at these increases. Over and over again, we've tested and seen that when you bring an alignment, an absolute integrity between the nature of the offer and the reality of its expression, you see this sort of prosperity and thriving. And so with that point, I should end my brief time and turn it over to the chair. And thank you again for your attention and time.